Good evening.
Thanks so much for joining.
First of all, thank you all for making the time to join us. Obviously, the goal of today's webinar is to share a little bit more detail and information with you guys around some of the information and research we've done around HPP. A lot of it revolves around like our own testing. If any of you guys have seen our blog posts online, a lot of that similar information will be here, but our goal is to, of course, make it a little bit more understandable and also have some discussions, Q&A with you guys around it.
Perfect. Awesome. Thanks, Jennifer. For some of you guys who are maybe a little bit newer to Viva, I also just wanted to, off the bat, just mention. So, Jennifer, you probably are more familiar with. Her face is definitely over social media more than mine is. I am on the operations and product R&D side. So my name is Zach. I'm one of the co-founders, and really, like today, we're just going to go over all of the intricacies of how we explored HPP and landed where we are. So I know many of you have already maybe read the FAQs, the blog post. This is just going to be a bit more detail and going through it. And as Jennifer mentioned, please don't hesitate to shoot questions to us. We definitely are going to keep an eye on those and answer them as they come in and as they're relevant. If it seems like something is going to be covered in a later slide, we may hold for a little bit, but we definitely want to make sure that we answer all your questions and there's definitely no bad questions. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and we'll sort of roll through everything. Okay, a really high level overview. What is high pressure processing? Recently, we were reminded that it's not smart to always abbreviate as HPP. We found out that actually this is a new terminology for many of you guys. So, at a really high level, of course, this sort of makes natural sense, but we're using cold water and pressure to inactivate pathogens. It's the primary goal of using the technology is for food safety, and it is quite common across both human and pet food. So a lot of you guys probably have already, food in your fridges or have definitely consumed food that has been HPP'd. So for example, like cold pressed juice, the reason it's called cold pressed is because it is, cold and pressure, which is exactly, the same technology. Also dips like guacamole, hummus, stuff like that, and even deli meats. Like if you have like turkey breast or roast beef, those are high pressure processed as well. And just a little clip to give you an idea of what this looks like in our products. This is sort of an overview actually at the facility that we're using to high pressure process our food. Everything is loaded into baskets. The basket goes into a chamber. That chamber is filled up with water and then, of course, pressurized. And then it's held for a certain amount of time at a certain pressure. Those are the parameters that are most important. And then afterwards, of course, the water is released, everything comes out. And then there's actually a step to actually dry off the packages just to make sure that everything is going to freeze okay and not stick to each other, which is very, very important. And then afterwards, it's frozen. Yeah, that's a really high level overview. And then jumping into, like why we're all here on this presentation tonight. To be very honest, like Jennifer and I, we were both hesitant about HPP. And I think we also had a lot of the same questions that maybe many of you do about the technology. Since day one of starting the company, we were aware of this technology, but not sure exactly if it was sort of the right answer for us. And sort of just to go into that a little bit deeper, like our journey within food safety began a couple of years ago when we started the company, and we've looked at a myriad of different technologies. For example, we looked at organic lactic acid sprays to apply over the surface of meat. We've even explored bacteriophages, probiotics, which many of you are probably familiar with because that is the most recent technology that we have used, and then now HPP. Ultimately, even when we were looking at probiotics and landing at probiotics, there was a big decision point because at that point in time, we were also evaluating HPP and decided that we weren't sort of ready to go ahead with HPP because of how it affected the look and feel of our food. So ultimately, that's why we ended up with probiotics and made that decision there because we were very, very confident in that technology and the research that we had developed. Everything that we do, we always test within our own products. That is definitely something that is held very near and dear to our hearts. It's one thing to look at research and decide, hey, like we think that this works. It's another thing altogether to test it in our own products and make sure that it works. So ultimately, with all the, hesitancy, I think just in the space and in the industry in general, that's what led us to have some sort of like, preconceived notions or, if you will, misconceptions about the technology and why it took us so long to really, really develop out all of our research for HPP. But with that being said, ultimately, we are, always going to use data to make our decisions. And what we were doing behind the scenes, even whilst we're using probiotics, for the past year, we were testing all the various different aspects of HPP to understand if, the concerns that we had were valid, or maybe we were learning something else. So as a result, this is sort of, what we wanted to share with all of you guys. So going through some of the HPP questions that we had, and maybe some of these will, click with you, and maybe these are the, similar to the ones that you may have. And certainly if there's others that we're not covering, we would love to know. Maybe we have looked at them and just didn't fit them into this presentation, or other things that we would love to continue exploring, because we're always learning every day. So of course, the primary goal of HPP is to kill pathogens. So one, does it even work effectively? Secondarily, and I will say the rest of the questions are more so product quality driven. So, I think there has been a lot of data out there to show that HPP is effective against pathogens, but I think most of the concerns that people have about the technology overall lie within other attributes of how it affects the food. So that's sort of where the remainder of our questions and the bulk of what we'll spend this presentation on, which is one, like, sorry, secondarily, does it affect the nutrient levels within our food? Does it affect the nutrients themselves and like decrease those? Does it destroy good bacteria? A lot of people feed raw and want to sort of do so for the benefits of thinking that the good bacteria in the meat are actually helping their pets. Does it cause changes to the product quality or the palatability of the food, which is incredibly important? Of course, no one wants, their pet to not enjoy the same meals that they did previously. And then lastly, I have this sort of catch-all bucket of other HPP concerns that, we had at the time that we were exploring. So, including fat oxidation seemed to be a concern, as well as like what happens with enzymes, natural enzymes in the meat, as well as plastic leaching, because anytime anyone does process product with HPP, it's going to be in some sort of packaging. So we're going to go through all these questions, and the sort of the goal through this past year was to go through all these questions and test all of them through and understand at the end of the day, what is the reality. So after all these hours of testing, we're sort of landing here where we are today. We obviously decided that it was a technology that we wanted to proceed with. But we're just here to share a little bit about what we learned, and hopefully you learned something. We're not here to sort of change your opinions one way or another. We're really just here to share what we've learned, and hopefully that's helpful. Okay. So going through, all the questions that I have sort of laid out, the first one being, does it even work? So in order to go into a little bit of detail there, I just wanted to sort of do a quick foray into an intro to microbiology and specifically how we think about, log reductions. And this is a term that we're going to use throughout this presentation, which is why it's important. Um, of course, when we're talking about microorganisms, it's often in really large quantities. So as a result, we sort of developed a system to talk about them in an exponential way. So for example, in this first petri dish, I have like 100 bacterial cell, or sorry, 1,000 bacterial cells. One log reduction is not just a linear reduction, it's actually an exponential reduction. And each log is actually, a 10x reduction, on top of the last reduction. So for example, going from 1,000, one log reduction is actually a 90% reduction to just 100 cells. And then a two log reduction is actually a 99% reduction now from the original group down to 10 cells. And of course, three log is just one cell remaining. So as you can see, as you go up in log reductions, it's actually exponential. And it represents a drastic increase in the overall reduction of pathogen cells in our case when we discuss them, and of course overall risk reduction in general. The other way to sort of think about this, I have sort of developed a scale from, 1 to 7. Of course, this looks linear, and we just discussed that it wasn't linear, but this is more just a representation. I wanted to give you guys an idea of like where things that you guys may be more familiar with would land on the scale. So, for example, like Lysol is actually a 3 log reduction. If you're like spraying a surface and wiping it with any sort of like antibacterial, it's a 3 log reduction of just, bad bacteria. Whereas like cooking meat and poultry, on a pan to a safe and ready to eat temperature is actually, between a 5 to 7 log reduction. So that's definitely very, very safe. Our target with HPP was to be above a 5 log reduction. So somewhere over that 5 logs basically at the equivalent levels of safety, comparative to cooking meat and poultry. Ultimately, this 5 log reduction, we're going to repeat it a lot through this presentation. It's a 99.999% reduction. So, of course, that just sounds extreme, but overall, it's been held by both us as a company as well as the FDA as a benchmark, as like, the gold standard, because it's a really dramatic reduction in risk level overall. Okay, so going through our testing process for the whole big does it work question, the first thing we did was we worked with actually a university to inoculate samples with all the pathogens of concern. In this case, one thing to mention is that we were using cocktails. So we weren't just using like one Salmonella species. It was important for us to represent it across a wide variety of different strains. Afterwards, we're of course HPing these samples based on the time and pressure that we are going to be selecting. And then after that, we're freezing these samples right after HPP, and then we're basically counting those bacterial cells and seeing how many of those bad bacterial cells survived and how many of them did we successfully kill by using HPP. So I'm going to walk through our results. This first chart is probably going to seem a little bit confusing, but it'll make a lot of sense after I sort of walk through it. So going through our results from doing this study, that bright purple bar is the before HPP representation, and then that sort of blue grayish color is the after HPP levels. On the y-axis or vertically, I have that as the overall logs of bad bacteria within our food. And in this specific chart, I'm just going to be showing chicken. We also tested in beef and rabbit as well to represent our overall different proteins. But as you can see, we started with close to 9 logs, 8.7 logs of E. coli within, our chicken. And then after HPP, we're at less than 1 log. So overall, basically we're just taking the 8.76 minus 1. The actual log reduction that we saw was greater than 7. And our target log reduction, of course, was just 5. So in this case, we definitely hit our goal in reducing E. coli. For Salmonella, we had 7 to start, got to less than 1, so we did achieve our goal of a 5 log reduction as well. And similarly with Listeria, the same happened. We inoculated close to 7 logs, reduced less to 1, had over a 5 log reduction. So overall in our chicken, we saw really, really good results. We also did the exact same thing in our beef protein, where we exceeded that 5 log reduction across the board for all the 3 pathogens, as well as our rabbit. So across the board, we hit the numbers that we're looking for. And I am going through this very, very quickly, but definitely the data and the numbers all exist on our blog. So if you wanted to spend a little bit more time looking at it, definitely can. And let us know if you have any specific questions regarding these. So overall, our summary of the whole does it work question was that overwhelmingly yes. We did exceed a 5 log reduction, which was our goal, of course, for all the pathogens of concern. So Salmonella, Listeria, and E. coli. So it's a very, very severe reduction in pathogen risk overall in our food. All right, so going on to the other questions, now that we sort of checked that box off, does HPP alter nutrient levels? I imagine these are the rest of the questions that you guys are probably going to be a bit more interested in learning about. So our process to test nutrients was a little bit different than historically, what we have seen, at least with the data that does exist out there. We've seen a lot of data that just compares one data point before HPP to one data point after HPP. What we did was that we actually took three samples that we did in HPP and then compared them with another three samples that we did HPP. The importance of this is that ultimately, we are running nutrient panels on all six of these samples separately to gather, basically six different levels of, say, protein in every single sample and six different, samples of like fat. Um, those data points, we then were able to develop these averages and standard deviations for each group. So the no HPP group had its own average and standard deviation, as well as the HPP group also had its average and standard deviation. The reason why this is so important is because those three samples allow us to understand variability much better than just one sample. Otherwise, it'd be really, really hard to know if you saw an increase or a decrease after HPP, whether or not it was legitimate or if it was just due to the natural sampling variability that can, of course, occur if you sample from one spot within, any sort of batch from, compared to like another spot in that batch. So we'll go into this a little bit more, but before we do that, I just wanted to give a sort of summary of the nutrients that we did look at. We looked at over 50 plus nutrients. We actually had to trim it down a little bit, specifically for the ones that are, I guess you could say, more important or the AFCO related nutrients. So macronutrients, of course, these should be very, very familiar with you guys. Protein, fat, moisture, these are the ones that are on your labels. Minerals, as well as vitamins, fatty acids, and then also amino acids. So we wanted to make sure that we covered, all of our bases across the board for all the major nutrient groups that matter within your pet's nutrition. I'm going to go into each one in a very detailed way, but really, I just wanted to start with macronutrients and give you, a representation of how we did look at this data. So, of course, looking at, protein, fat, carbohydrate levels, ash content, moisture, dry matter. Um, Before HPP, we had a certain set of numbers that were the averages that we were seeing within our sample. And then, of course, after HPP, we had a different set of numbers. And remember, these are averages within those three samples. But when you look at these, distinctly, what we sort of realized is, yeah, we can see, a bit of an increase in protein, a bit of a decrease in fat. Maybe carbohydrate didn't change that much. But we're seeing like little swings that we didn't really know how to make sense of these. Ultimately, what we're seeing is we don't really understand whether or not it is as a result of variability until we pull in things like standard deviation. So what we did to sort of better represent this visually for you guys is, we wanted to sort of scale this down and show you those sort of error bars. Ultimately, with one data point, it's really hard to know if it is just due to natural sampling variability or if it is a real increase or decrease. But with these three data points, we are able to use standard deviation and account for that variability. So sort of illustrated into something that is a little bit more visually easy to understand. We had these averages of the before HPP levels of each of these different nutrients, protein, fat, carbohydrate, etc. So these I'm going to illustrate with red dots. These are those averages that you just saw for before HPP. And then we sort of have these other averages that we're finding based on the samples after HPP. And mind you, these are again averages that are developed using three data points for the before HPP group and three data points for the after HPP group. What this means is that you can kind of see, sometimes that blue dot is a little bit higher than that red one. Sometimes it's a little bit lower. But again, like for example, for ash, that one looks, kind of high. But is that real or is that just as a result of the natural sampling variability? So what we did was we started to drop in those bars that represent standard deviation or essentially that variability to better understand, if it is statistically significant that these two values are different. And what we started seeing is that where you have those overlay within those overall, that red bar being that standard deviation for the before HPP and that blue bar being the standard deviation for that after HPP result, wherever they overlap, if you will, that is basically, a given that they're not going to be statistically significantly different from one another. I am definitely, you could say, simplifying this a little bit for you guys who are statistically minded or remember your AP stats classes. What we did do ultimately is that we did run a significance test. It's called a two sample t-test if you want to look into that a little bit more. There's also some more details on the blog and actually, ran to figure out based on those variations that we're seeing between those three data points, whether or not the values that we were seeing or the differences in those variations were actually significant representations of the difference or if it was just from sampling variance. So ultimately, you can see across the board, macronutrient wise, we didn't find anything that was significantly different because all those bars are overlapping in all cases. Jumping to minerals, very similar here. Originally, if you just look at those red dots and those blue dots, you can see maybe, calcium looks a little lower, phosphorus looks a little lower. But once you pull in those bars, you start to realize that there is actually a wider standard deviation. And we did observe certain values that were higher on the phosphorus side, or we did observe certain values that were higher from the calcium side to result in that sort of variation. So in this case, there were no minerals that were significantly different from the before and the after HPP group. Vitamins is a little bit more interesting. It's very similar in the sense that most of them don't have any sort of significantly different results. But the only one that's worth calling out is vitamin B3. If you notice, this is the only two bars that the red bar and that blue bar, they don't quite touch and overlap. And what this means is that those standard deviations are far apart enough that it is significantly different. So what we found was that B3 was higher post HPP. This is kind of an interesting result because we haven't seen it replicated in other studies prior to this. But we are looking into it a little bit more, and really we think that with some additional sampling, we can better understand whether or not this is a legitimate increase. Some thinking is that with some additional sampling, this may actually not be as pronounced as we're seeing here. But the other thing to mention is that this B3 is an increase after HPP. So there is no concern here of nutrient deficiency, and there is no AFCO upper limit for vitamin B3. And then going to fatty acids, very similarly, we're seeing those variation bars all overlap. So nothing is significantly different. And then this is probably a little hard to see on the smaller side, but amino acids actually had, standard deviations that were quite tight. But across the board, both the red bars and blue bars were overlapping, and nothing that we were comparing directly from a numeric standpoint did we find any sort of significance to be different. Okay, so I went through a lot there. So if you have any specific questions about how to better understand some of the statistical aspect of how we sort of determine this, definitely feel free to let us know. But overall, as a summary, are there any effects on nutrients? We did see that one nutrient out of the 50 that we tested had a significant change. It was actually an increase of about 10% after HPP, but there is no AFCO upper limit. So again, this isn't really a concern. It's something that we're going to just test a little bit more on just to understand better why this, was seen in the first place. The other 49 out of 50 nutrients did not change and did not have any sort of statistically significant difference from the pre versus post HPP results. Generally, we saw that HPP doesn't alter nutrient levels, and as a result, we also didn't make any changes to the formulation of any of the recipes that you guys are currently using. And the other thing to sort of mention from a biological standpoint that is very interesting is that this is actually expected. This may be surprising to some of you guys, and certainly to us, it was a little surprising. But if you look at the biology of how this works, heat, of course, is one of those factors that we are very familiar with that affects nutrients. So that's the whole reason why a lot of us like to feed raw, because heat does break up covalent bonds, which are what holds nutrients together and can decrease nutrient levels. Especially there are some more heat sensitive nutrients like vitamins, for example, that do break easier just with less, energy there. But the difference with pressure is that it only breaks these weaker non-covalent bonds, which are the ones that, disrupt cell function once they're broken. So for example, like the cell's ability to operate, but it doesn't actually break those core building block bonds that are what holds nutrients together. So as a result, it's killing those pathogens that are, of course, harmful for our pets, but it's not actually affecting um, the nutrient levels of like amino acids or proteins or fats or anything like that. So that's actually why none of these change significantly. And this is seen across the board with all sorts of studies that are replicated, is that pressure doesn't actually change nutrient levels. Okay. So we sort of checked off, does HPP alter nutrient levels? This was quite surprising for us, but scientifically and biologically, it does make sense. The other big question that we had, honestly, going to this was, does HPP destroy good bacteria? As raw feeders ourselves, even from the beginning, our understanding was that, yeah, there is good bacteria in the raw meat that we're giving our pets, and we would want that to contribute to their guts. So overall, we sort of did a test to start to understand the levels at which HPP could affect good bacteria. The group that we looked at is called lactic acid bacteria. This is kind of a larger group that encapsulates and sort of loosely represents what people are looking for when it comes to good bacteria. But importantly, it's important to mention that it also captures some more innocuous strains that are not necessarily probiotic and not harmful either. So in general, it's just a parent group that is sort of a catch-all bucket of like reasonably okay bacteria. So before HPP, we saw that there was almost 7 logs of lactic acid bacteria in chicken. And then after HPP, we dropped that to about 1.6. So this was about a 5 log reduction. What we saw in beef was kind of similar, maybe a little bit subdued, but we did see close to a 4 log reduction in beef of lactic acid bacteria. And in rabbit, it was also around a 4 log reduction. So somewhere in the neighborhood of a 3 to 5 log reduction. Honestly, this is not super surprising, and it didn't surprise us because the reality is that pressure acts upon microorganisms equally. It doesn't say like target the bad bacteria and not the good bacteria. So across the board, we were expecting some level of reduction of lactic acid bacteria as well. But, on the surface level, honestly, it seemed concerning until we better understood, a little bit deeper. What we started to understand was, okay, if acid bacteria are being cut, how do they actually affect the health of my pet? And what we found is that, for example, just to put numbers to it, the amount of lactic acid bacteria that is in a serving of like raw food, for example, we just sort of generalize here. So using a 30-pound dog and like the serving that they might eat over a day is 454 million CFUs or colony forming units. Um, Only a fraction of those are actually probiotic. So that shaves it down to about 45 million, CFUs. Um, Taking another look at this, the highest amount of a specific probiotic strain is going to be even less. So, for example, like the strains that are probiotic, this is just overall any strains that are, probiotic. But if you look at a specific strain within that group, it's very unlikely that it's going to be very high. So I guess you could technically say that it could be up to that 10%, but really in reality, there's going to be a lot of different strains in there that make up that group of 45 million. So usually, 50% is probably pretty high in terms of one specific strain within that grouping as a representation. When we looked at the effective dosage of a single strain in a serving of probiotics to be considered, having any sort of like efficacious effect on our pets in a therapeutic way on their guts, it was actually 1 to 10 billion CFUs. This bar that I'm sort of trying to represent visually is around the 1 billion mark. I couldn't even represent the 10 billion mark because just think of a bar that's like 10 times that size. In reality, the effective dosage is anywhere between 1 to 10 billion. And you can just see how different that is compared to its magnitudes different from the amount of probiotics that are within raw food. So ultimately, this is what honestly shocked us. I think there's probably a lot of information about there about just how important it is to feed our pets raw because of the beneficial microbes that you're putting into their guts. But the reality is actually far from that. The main way in which like our food and any raw food affects the microbiome is by the balance of proteins and fats and carbs, and really, of course, heavier on protein and fat side and lower on the carbohydrate slash filler side that feed the good gut bacteria that thrive off of that balance. But it's not actually by adding those good bacteria into the gut physically. So ultimately, yeah, raw food is absolutely great for your gut microbiome, but it's not good for the gut microbiome in the way that we may think it is. The physical addition of those gut microbes is very, very minute in the grand scheme of things. It's like taking a bucket of water and trying to pour it into a lake. It's not going to be affecting it that much from a real, like, physical addition standpoint. So we're pretty surprised by that. Just in terms of all the research that we're doing, it was definitely an eye opener and does show you just how much information is out there that may be misconstrued. And if you don't dig a level deeper, it's hard to actually find the truth. So I think that was very, very interesting to us. And then, of course, a really important question to us, does HPP cause changes to the product quality and palatability of our food? So what I actually have here is just a video of this because I thought it'd be easier to represent these things rather than talk about them. But overall, you can kind of see on my screen here. It may be a little hard. There's probably other videos on the website of this, but on the top you have HPP food. I'm actually going to pause there. And then on the bottom you have non-HPP food. There's going to be a little bit of visual difference, probably to you as the pet parent, definitely not to your pet. In terms of like how it looks, it may be a little bit lighter in color, and then it may be a little bit stiffer in texture, but otherwise it's pretty hard to notice. It got to the level where both me and Jennifer, we really can't tell the difference when we're feeding Karoo, whether it's like HPP'd or non-HPP'd packages within our refrigerator. To be honest, this was a big part of like our R&D to make sure that there wouldn't be a significant change. And I think we've done a pretty good job. Just even looking at like this freeze frame right here, it's pretty hard to actually tell a significant difference. And part of the reason we were able to do that is because we do HPP in a vacuum seal package, whereas a lot of other companies that do HPP do it and then actually open up chubs and then regrind it, exposing it to oxidation, and exposing it to, that regrinding processing step, which does result in much more discoloration. So we're able to bypass all that by just, HPing in that finished packaging, which is very, very helpful. The other thing that I'll say about palatability is that, all the studies that we have seen have indicated no change in palatability. And in some cases, actually pets prefer HPP food compared to non-HPP food. So there's really, really not going to be a big difference during that transition phase. Okay. And then finally, this sort of catch-all bucket for a bunch of other various different HPP concerns that we did have when we were doing some research. Fat oxidation is an interesting one. Um, there have been some papers that discuss, how fat oxidation can happen at really, really high levels of pressure or for really long hold times. One thing that we did note is that the hold times where people were seeing those fat oxidation, data occur were really, really high. So, for example, like 20-minute hold times, we are, not holding more than a couple minutes. So it is a pretty significant difference. And of course, the level at which you're exposing those raw materials to oxygen also makes a big difference. In our case, it is vacuum sealed. But we still wanted to make sure that we tested this to better understand, does it make a difference in our food? So the thing that we measured is called peroxide value. It's just an indicator, not super important to understand at a deep level, but it's basically just an early, indicator of rancidity. I'm going to refer to it as PV. So on the y-axis, what you're seeing here is a PV value. And then, of course, the purple bar is before HPP. That bluish grayish bar is after HPP. We actually saw a slight decline. Of course, with similar to any of the other data that we're taking, we did take 3 data points. So these are the averages of those 3 data points and found that like it was within the standard deviation and error and of variability that we'd expect. So those two values we found were not different from one another. There was no increase in rancidity after HPP. And then that other line, that red line at the top there at 10, that's actually like what's widely perceived to be sort of a cutoff or, you know, an acceptable PV for fresh and stable fats. And of course, both of these values that we saw in all six of the samples, of course, that we took were well below that level. So indicating that we, of course, had, fresh, stable fats within our food before HPP as well as after HPP. Does HPP affect enzyme activity? This is another really interesting question that I think we also, as we dug deeper here, got a better understanding of the science that was, you know, honestly a bit of a debunk for us. So the reality is that some enzymes in raw meat can be affected, but importantly, the enzymes in raw meat are not the same enzymes as the ones that we may think matter for our pet's gut and digestion. The enzymes in our pet's gut that are used for digestion are stomach acid or gastric enzymes, pancreatic enzymes. They're not those same ones as the ones that we can find in raw food or delivered by meat. So physically, the enzymes that are, entering the gut through the raw meat aren't the ones that are actually helpful to them for digestion. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that even if they could help, they would be denatured immediately by stomach acids. So very, very few enzymes actually survive through that, acidic pathway. So really, I think it's one of these other things that has been shared over time of like, raw meat offers beneficial bacteria and then also offers enzymes that don't actually matter in the same way that we may think that they do. And then, of course, does HPP increase plastic leaching into the food? This was definitely a big discussion point. Of course, everything that we do is within plastic, but we wanted to better understand because, especially certainly it feels as if you were to, increase pressure on plastic and food, it could cause leaching. But the reality is that we found, pressure does not affect plastic polymers in the same way that heat does. Heat is often the main driver because, it actually can break those plastic polymer bonds. And if you remember back to the nutrition slide that we're talking about, how nutrients are formed of covalent bonds, plastic polymers are also made up of those covalent bonds. So very similarly, heat can break up those bonds or mess up those bonds. But pressure can't because pressure does not create enough energy to do so. So as a result, you actually don't have plastic leaching into the food with the application of HPP. Whereas you can have it if you say like microwave in plastic or heat things in plastic. Of course, it's kind of a no-brainer that that's not a really, really good idea, and for good reason. The last thing that we'll say on this front is that we are continuing to look a little bit more into this because this seems like an area where overall, like you guys have questions and we do too. We do use BPA-free food grade packaging, and scientifically, all the different packaging groups that have published about this have said sort of unanimously that this is not of concern, just through all the literature and the tests that have been done. But we're also looking for ways to test it in our own product because ultimately, as you sort of have learned through this entire presentation, we're always trying to test things in our own food. The tricky thing is identifying the specific test to run and what represents this the best. But as we sort of go along that journey, we're definitely going to share, data that we have. Okay, so this is where we sort of landed, and really appreciate you guys, tuning in and going through all this. But essentially, we had all these different questions that we had at the start of this HPP journey and needed to make sure that we were ticking off all the boxes and understanding deeply within our products how HPP measures up for these concerns. And we found that across the board, there were not really, any concerns that still stood valid at the end of this whole evaluation. So ultimately, we're at back at this question, of course, that you guys probably all have, which is why are we adopting HPP? And there's a couple important reasons for it. Firstly, it's just greater pathogen reduction. So the probiotics that we have been using previously are highly effective, but HPP can eliminate even larger quantities of pathogens, which makes the food that much more safe. So in this case, of course, we mentioned, we're targeting a 5 log reduction, and we're able to hit that, which is killing 99.999% of pathogens. The other thing about HPP is that it is a more consistent application within our food safety program. The probiotics that we're using, of course, are a biological organism. They are going to be more sensitive to the environment, and depending on the conditions and how they are contacting pathogens, they actually, of course, need to actually make contact with pathogens to kill them. It just is a bit more sensitive to make sure that it acts the same way and is effective in the same way every single time that we use it. Conversely, HPP does act on everything, from a mechanical standpoint. So it's easier to control the pressure and the hold time and to replicate it over and over and over again, which of course, when it comes to, our production is incredibly important to ensure every batch is as safe as every other batch that we're making. And finally, and probably most importantly, we found that there was no significant effect on the quality of the food that we're making for you guys. We didn't find that there were effects on nutrient content or fat oxidation or palatability, et cetera. And then others, where we do see some levels change, ultimately it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. So when it comes to beneficial bacteria, the way in which our food offers benefits to your pet's gut microbiome is completely, different from the way that you would think, which is why the levels of beneficial bacteria from actually food are insignificant. So ultimately, after learning all of this, we decided that HPP was the best technology with, what we were learning and from all the research that we did within our food. And the last parting thing I'll say, more so just for what does this mean for me and my pets? We don't expect there to be any sort of transition problems because the nutritional makeup does not change. If you remember, switching to raw from definitely something like a dry food, you can have a little bit of GI upset. That's because, those gut microbes are changing pretty significantly from ones that feed off of things like carbohydrates to, more that feed off of protein and fats. But in this case, that macronutrient makeup is not changing. But with that being said, you can familiarize them a little bit with the new food by just mixing it with some non-HPP food. But either way, we don't really see any concerns with just the transition overall. So it should go very, very smooth. But certainly our team is here to help and answer any questions along the way. Okay. Well, appreciate you guys sticking with us. Let me pause there real quick and just check if there's any questions.
Yeah, feel free to put them in the Q&A box if there's still anything that's a little bit unclear. Okay. It looks like we covered everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
I
and
saw some good comments about just saying thank you. No, thank you guys for jumping on in the first place, and glad that you guys were able to make it, and just happy to be sharing some of this information.
okay. I think we got one question around which shipment will the HPP products start. Zach, you want to answer that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as of this week, there can be some products that are shipping that are HPP'd. It's going to be a bit difficult to say specifically, like uh, if your products, say like you're ordering a specific set of proteins, are going to be HPP versus non-HPP, because the transition is going to depend a little bit on like, what's in the specific warehouse you're ordering from, as well as like how many people are ordering that product. So it's a bit hard for us to say, but generally the best guideline is that anytime after now that you're ordering, you may receive HPP product. But the actual transition to fully HPP product is probably going to take a month or two. So certainly, the sooner you order, the more likely you are to receive some non-HPP product. And the later on that you order, you're probably going to be more likely to receive more HPP product.
Yeah, so you can tell. So the follow-up question was like if they will be marked. So on
Mhm.
our website, on our HPP FAQ page, we have the specific um, lot number and best by date, where everything after that date is going to be HPP'd. So if you're not, if you're having trouble finding that like date, which is going to be printed on the package, just send us an email and we'll share that with you. Okay. Yeah, I mean, if you guys come across any questions later on, you have our email info@vivarawpets.com. Feel free to reference like, hey, I watched a webinar and like I saw something afterwards, or I thought of something afterwards, had a question. We'll make sure to get you guys any answers or clarify anything that you may still have questions on.
Definitely. Definitely don't be strangers. We love questions here. If there are things that, we didn't think of, we'd love to know. And we're always the type of people that want to um, dig deeper and understand better. So yeah, I really appreciate you guys just taking an interest in spending your Wednesday evening with us. It means a lot. And of course, just thank you so much for just being a part of our community and feeding our food and supporting us and our team. It really, really means the world to us. So, cannot say that enough.
All right. Thank you guys. Hope everyone has a good evening.
And stay warm. It's kind of
Yeah.
scary out there, depending on where you are in the US these days. So hope everyone is staying safe and warm and yeah, hopefully all this crazy weather goes away soon.